Call to order this special meeting for City of East Grand Forks, Tuesday, August 27th, 2019 is now 5 o'clock. City Clerk, please call roll.
Mayor Steve Gander.
Here.
Council President Mark Olstead.
Here.
Council Vice President Chad Grassel.
Here.
Council Members Clarence Vetter.
Here.
Dale Helms.
Here.
Tim Riopel.
Here.
Tim Johnson.
Here.
Mark Demers.
Does term quorum. Old business number 1, consider adopting recreation participation policy and non-resident participation request form, which will be effective beginning the 2019-20 winter activity season. Motion. Moved by Grassel. Second. Second by Riopel. Any questions and discussion?
I do, and Reid and I exchanged some emails through the afternoon as for the question of what will be the role of the Park and Rec Commission in this deliberation going forward, and maybe we could just talk about that to make sure everyone is on the same page of what's going to happen if we go forward with this one the way that it's presented.
Reid?
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. After our council meeting last week, I visited with a few staff members, and we discussed at our Parks and Recreation Commission meeting that took place Wednesday of last week. And the recommendation or the proposal I have in front of you, to Mayor Gander's point, doesn't include any type of comment on the Parks and Recreation Commission advising on it at all anymore. The biggest reason for that is I went back to the bylaws of the Parks and Recreation Commission and looked through, kind of spent more time focusing on the purpose and the duties of that commission as we laid it out when we set the bylaws for that group. And it spells out there's 7 criteria or 7 bullets that the purpose and duties for the commission were. All of them are pretty much wrapped around obtaining citizen input and comments in regards to future planning, policy making to make policy recommendations to the city council, things of that matter. And so and when I looked back at that and reflected a little bit, had some discussion with different staff, I feel like this type of decision probably isn't within the purpose and the duties of the commission as we described it when we set the bylaws for that group, and it does fall more in line with the description of my job description in operating how our department operates. So that's the biggest reason why we removed that part of it. And so if we ever get a request, it would go through the Parks and Recreation Department office and ultimately to me to review that. And if there was ever a reason to file a grievance or to appeal my decision on that, then it would go to the city administrator, similar to any other decisions that I make within my role.
Anything to add to that, sir?
Sounds great. Thank you, Reid.
Anybody else have any questions or discussion on this? I see none. Do roll call.
Helms.
Yes.
Riopel.
Yes.
Johnson.
Yes.
Olstead.
Yes.
Grassel.
Yes.
Demers.
Yes.
Vetter.
Yes. Motion is carried. Entertain a motion to adjourn. Moved by Grassel, second by Riopel. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion is carried, means adjourned. Call to order the City Council work session for City of East Grand Forks for Tuesday, August 27, 2019 is now 5:03. City Clerk, please call roll.
Mayor Steve Gander.
Here.
Council President Mark Olstead.
Here.
Council Vice President Chad Grassel.
Here.
Council Members Clarence Vetter.
Here.
Dale Helms.
Here.
Tim Riopel.
Here.
Tim Johnson.
Here.
Mark Demers.
Present.
Does term quorum. Number 1, information, proposed new business. Justin, if you want to go up to the end there and make
Go to
sure the
the end.
mic's on,
Yep.
please.
It's been a while since I've been back, so I'm a little rusty.
Yeah, we missed you.
Yeah, right?
Just make sure your mic's on there.
Test, test, test.
Oh, is it, no, flip up. Perfect, it's on.
Yep, good. Yeah, so I guess from what I understand, there was kind of an ordinance with one person holding 2 liquor licenses, and I guess that has been addressed previous, or are we still addressing that?
We are in the process of
The
working
process,
on it.
okay.
Yeah.
So I currently am listed on the liquor license for Up North Beats Pub. I'm actually exiting the business, getting bought out. Got a few other ventures I've entered into, and we're actually looking at another restaurant as well. It just kind of, it's the old Tau Garden building. We've been in contact now with the landlord. Different concept. It was just kind of it started out as just checking in on the space. I'd literally never been in the building and saw that Tau Garden went out of business, and I was just curious. I mean, old building downtown. I just wanted to see what it was like. So upon doing so, just kind of surveyed the situation and was kind of doing numbers in my head and everything else, and just said, well, what the heck? I mean, if we can add another business, you know, to East Side, and we can do it, you know, for a relatively low investment, low risk, overhead, all that kind of stuff, why not look into it? So started proceeding a little bit, and it looks like something that we can do. When I called to inquire with Megan, she had just said that there was an ordinance on the books talking about one person holding 2 liquor licenses, so that's kind of what brought me here in the first place, but then also just to kind of talk a little bit about the business as well. So our concept is basically going to be called the Spud Junior. So those of you, obviously, that remember the old Spud Bar, it started as kind of a brainchild of our graphics and apparel shop being right behind the old bar, and it started just as kind of a little bit of a joke, really, about a year and a half ago, and just kind of rolled and continued to build up premise around what the place could be. And when I walked into this place, I just kind of said, I think it's a great concept, and I think it's something that could work. So let's move forward. So essentially, just kind of sitting here hoping that we can come to kind of a finalization on what would need to happen, whether it was an ordinance change or, you know, removing me from Up North's liquor license, as, you know, I will no longer be a part of the business. So then we could proceed forward with this one. So.
I guess if you want, what I'm doing right now is I have gotten direction to do a modification to the city's liquor license ordinance, which would take away that restriction to hold an interest in 2 different liquor licenses. So I'm in the process of doing an amendment there.
Okay. Sounds good. Is there kind of a time frame that we would be working with as far as when we think that would be accomplished?
I'm working on it right now, so then it's going to have to have 2 readings and then be published. You know, so the 2 readings, and then it would have to be approved by the council, and then it'd have to be published. So the 2 readings would have to go at 2 separate council meetings, not work sessions.
Sure.
So it'll probably be 6 weeks, I suppose.
Okay. Sounds good.
Gary, you have questions, sir?
Yep, and from the sounds of it, there are 2 ways to go for your liquor license. One is primarily a restaurant serving liquor. The other is primarily a bar-type license. Which of those are you leaning toward?
I think it could go either or. Realistically, you know, nowadays when you open even a restaurant with liquor and beer, you know, your sales are going to be higher than 60-40 typically anyway. So you're going to be more of a restaurant than you are a bar. So this is just kind of the idea, and the concept behind it is making it a little bit more a place for everybody to feel comfortable, whether it's construction workers at noon, all that kind of stuff. So just, I'd say, if I had to say it, I'd say more bar that serves great food, but at the end of the day, family friendly, all that, you know, just kind of maybe separating the space a little bit to have a little more delegated bar area. A lot, like North Dakota had the law where it had to be separate, so Buffalo Wild Wings has their own area. So maybe creating a little bit more of that type of a concept within the space. But
Thank you.
yeah.
Bill?
Thank you. I apologize. I didn't catch, what building did you say? What?
It's 302, so it's the old Tau Garden, previously Little Bangkok, right on the corner.
Oh,
of
okay,
Commerce and 30.
okay. Thank you.
Yep, yep.
So I'm assuming your process to get that going and our process to finalize and approve that are probably going to go hand in hand, side by
They
side.
would line up pretty well.
So,
Yeah.
okay. Do you have any more questions, Justin, at all for us?
Don't think so unless anybody else did.
Ron, do you have a timeline in mind for when the revision could happen?
Well, I'm going to try to have a draft of it done this week, because it's just a minor revision. And then I guess it'd be up to the council if they want to have it on next Tuesday's council meeting, and then it would have to go to the next one unless you wanted to come back to a work session, and then it would be pushed back an extra 2 weeks. Oh, but I should be able to get that done here and to Megan by Friday morning at the latest.
I personally would like to see it come back to the work session first, rather than, I don't know, it seems like we take things to the council and we end up moving it back here anyway, so let's look at it first, and then, that'd be my opinion.
So if that's the case, then I'll have it on the work session for the second Tuesday in September, and then if approved by this group, it would go on the next council meeting, which would be that following Tuesday.
That work for you?
That works. That
So
works.
really, the timeframe isn't going to be any different.
Perfect.
Thanks, Justin. Appreciate you coming in.
Thank you.
Number 2, request to form Safesport Committee. Reid.
Thank you again, Mr. President. I mentioned this last week at the council meeting when we passed the first couple sets of hockey policy for the Safesport as it relates to hockey, that I would bring this back to a work session just to look at the recommendation from Minnesota Hockey that we look at creating a Safesport committee in light of the fact that we don't operate under an association with a board of directors to handle Safesport complaints. So I just, in the works session, RCA, I listed just discussion with our staff. We came up with the idea to try to create a 6-person committee that could work together through the Safesport handbooks that USA Hockey and US Figure Skating have in place to try to talk through and discuss potential concerns we're going to have with how we're going to implement Safesport, how we're going to adhere to it within our buildings, how, if we have a complaint, how the complaint is handled differently between hockey and figure skating per their handbooks. If we could put together kind of a working committee to be able to have some of those conversations and work through that. And then at the same time, have those committee members be trained in Safesport, have their background checks conducted, so that should we ever have a complaint that needed to have an investigative panel and a hearing, that those 6 members could, 3 of those 6 members could be designated per complaint to be able to serve as a local hearing panel for it. So our suggestion, just as an idea to throw out to get us started, was to include a Blue Line Club board member, a figure skating club board member, one of our Parks and Recreation Commission members, and then 3 just community members, 3 interested volunteers from the community. The idea for that was that if we had a board member from each of those clubs and from our Park and Rec Commission, we feel like we'd have some interested parties right off the bat that would be interested in knowing more of the specifics of each of the sports that they're representing between the Blue Line Club and the Figure Skating Club. The Parks and Rec Commission member, if we wanted to discuss anything at a Park and Rec Commission or provide updates as a committee, that person could be kind of designated as the person that could lead that, give them something to help the commission kind of stay abreast with everything we're discussing within the Park and Rec department. And then 3 community volunteers, hopefully helping us to be able to, not to say that we're always going to be able to accomplish it, but hopefully be able to have people that are interested and trained and have the right, even potentially professional background to help understand and deal with some of the situations we're going through, but also to try to help further the possibility that if we have a complaint, we have some community members that maybe are not as vested to the program, on a hands-on basis, because we want to make sure that if we have a complaint that we can have a panel of 3 people that aren't specifically involved or have friends or children or relatives or anything of that matter involved in a complaint, should there ever be one. So that's where we came up with the basis of 6. We're kind of creating it ourselves on the fly here, so we're open to any suggestion of how we look at this for ourselves locally, but that's at least what I threw forward to start with and see what everybody thinks about it.
Anybody have any questions for Reid at this time? Mr. Gulstead?
I can't remember the policy, but are we supposed to have a designated investigative officer that starts, and who would that be?
The policy states if there is a complaint, it's specific per complaint, that out of these 6 people, we would designate somebody to do the investigation portion of it.
So it's different than the figure skating, which has a designated person right up front.
Well, yes, but even in some cases, the figure skating person, if they have knowledge of the situation before, when the complaint's filed, they can't be the investigative person. So the recommendation from both USA Hockey and US Figure Skating is to have a chairperson for each of those sports that knows the ins and outs, ups and downs of the policy. If it works in a perfect scenario, that should you need to do an investigation, that chairperson can serve as the investigator. That's the way that they like to see it. But it recognizes, the policy recognizes that that may not always be the case. For example, if you have a figure skating Safesport chairperson and the complaint is filed on the team that her daughter is skating on, then that person's not going to be able to serve as the investigator. So we'd have to designate somebody else within that committee to do so.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions or discussion on this matter? Mr. Demers?
Thank you, Mr. President. The three, first of all, when they come to conclusions with this board, do they have to be unanimous, or are they votes, or are they simple majority votes? Or?
That's a really good question. I don't know if I have the answer to that off the top of my head. I'd have to go back to the policy and read it a little more clear.
The reason I ask is if it's got to be a vote, you might want to have an odd number.
There's usually
would.
three
You'd
on
have
the,
three.
there's a 3 on the hearing panel.
Oh, 3 on the hearing panel.
Yeah.
Okay. And then wondering about the 3 community volunteers, if we want to make sure that we exempt, do we exempt like city employees or other people from those specific groups? Just so we make sure that we don't get a couple from them, just make sure that these are truly at-large positions. That's it.
That's a good idea.
Anybody else have anything?
I was just saying, I guess, I like that idea. I guess I would just add the caveat on that as far as to not prohibit somebody from the city being on it. I mean, they could be a public works person or whatever, something along those lines,
Right.
but maybe not like a Parks and Rec person in there.
True.
But
That's what
just
I'm-
because they're a city employee,
Exactly.
they should.
And I did, sorry to jump back in, but I did include that I would recommend that one of our staff people be part of this committee as a 7th member, is the way I listed in the RCA. Just because between whether that's myself, Mark, or Katie, one of the 3 of us should, I think, be included in any of the conversation, because there's going to be a lot of, even beyond the potential hearings we're going to have, we have a lot to work through in how we're going to adhere and follow through on the policies, even when it relates to access to locker rooms and situations with our Zamboni operators and when they do and don't have access and so forth. So there's a lot to it that we need to work through even at that level going forward.
And, go ahead.
For the 3 at large, if that could be a guideline that they not be affiliated with our programs and not a hard, fast rule. Because what if you have a 3-year-old and 2 years later the child moves into some low level of skating or hockey, or at age 6 or 7, you're off of that, and yet you're very effective and good at it. So it could be a general guideline to keep those folks away from the programs, but I don't think it has to be a hard, fast rule. That would be my opinion.
And thinking about the city thing is, thinking that the city is the organization that's administering this policy. So I guess the liability is ours. I would say, even if it isn't a direct person in public or Park and Rec, I think just being the city, I think you may have some bias towards the city's point of view. I would hate for it to even appear that we're investigating ourselves, when our policies and our oversight on this would be the one thing that would be being judged. So I get your point, but I'm kind of walking back. I think if we can eliminate city employees as much as possible.
I understand your point. I think that's a good one. Yeah.
Just a reminder that any decision that's made here simply gets pushed forward to the Minnesota Hockey, and they make the final decision. They can override whatever we make.
Correct. Very good point. Yep. And that has happened in situations in other communities that has happened. The only other point I was going to make is in talking about the community volunteers, I haven't directly started having conversations with anybody or asking people if they're interested, but the first demographic of people that I think I'd lean or go to for these types of volunteers would be like parents of alumni members of our programs, parents that have been through the system, whether it be through hockey or figure skating, that have an understanding of how the programs work and how they're operated, but maybe don't have children that are involved in it anymore because they've graduated or become adults on their own or those kinds of things. I think that would be a very strong demographic of people that we could lean to that would be capable, invested in it because they've seen the benefits that it has for their children, and would certainly be level-headed enough to be able to make some of these tough decisions should they come.
Anybody else have anything? If not, you got the right direction, and do you have to bring that, Reid, do you have to bring that back to us again for?
Yeah, I think what I'll do, just based off some of the discussion and comments we had, I'll try to type up something a little bit more formal, similar to some of the policies you've seen in the last few weeks that maybe states out the purpose and duties of the committee and how it could be comprised, and get something in writing so that you all could approve that and say that, yes, you're set to move forward with these parameters, so to speak.
You want to bring, maybe at that same time, you'd have maybe names, you can do it at the same time, or?
Yeah, we could work towards that, absolutely. If you're all okay with that.
Or you have something else?
Thinking 2 moves ahead, would the deliberations of that committee be subject to public information, or could it be privileged private information? Probably want to.
I'll have to look at that.
Good question.
I think that at some point, depending upon the circumstances, it becomes public.
Yeah, if you want to maybe get the head wrapped around that, that'd be helpful.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Reid.
Thank you.
Move on to number 3, discussion on special assessment policy. Mr. Murphy.
Thank you, Council President. The last time we discussed this, the direction was to get a few other additional cities, particularly ones that are a little bit closer to us. For example, most specifically Crookston, Thief River Falls, and the city of Grand Forks. With the caveat being Grand Forks is in another state and has some slightly different rules. So with that, I have done that, and it was fairly interesting here again. The city of Crookston has a fairly short policy. The city of Grand Forks has a much longer policy, but it's not quite as specific as far as how it determines what it charges. And the city of Thief River Falls has a very specific policy, a very definite policy. However, it's not formalized really or written down or adopted. It's based on past practice. So with that, I put those in your packet for discussion. I'll just go through them just real briefly and kind of hit the high points on them. So the Thief River Falls one was actually quite interesting. So with the new construction, the water and sewer lines are 100% assessed to the property owners. The street improvements are 60% property owner, 40% city, and 100% property owner for driveway aprons. And if a lift station is required, there is a potential for a deferred assessment based on timing and other things he said. For reconstructions, street improvements are 60% property owner, 40% city, which is the same as new construction. Over 100% property owner for alleys. Side streets are 50-50. Frontage roads are 80% property owner, 20% city. And the same for sidewalks, 80% property, 20% city. And reconstructions, 100% city for water and sewer main replacements. The one thing that they do is street reconstruction assessment costs are calculated at a 36-foot wide, 7-ton street. So any oversizing from that standard then is, the cost of that is borne by the city. Crookston is more of a unique way that they approach it. It's I've heard of it, but it's much more rare. They have a per front foot cost that's set in their statute. So reconstruction, they they charge the residents $40 per front foot. Overlays $15 per front foot. Full mill and overlay $20 per front foot. So it doesn't really matter what the costs come in, that's what is being charged. So anything over that cost then is borne by the city. Grand Forks was a lot more interesting as far as it had a lot of definitions and district boundaries. The one thing I thought was kind of interesting is that they have a expanded district, which they say is an attempt to recognize the community benefit of classified streets, which they appears to mean like collector streets and arterial streets, that there's a larger benefit for that they charge to surrounding property owners. They don't really give a percentage breakdown as far as what's assessed and what's borne by the city. What they state in there is the actual cost of constructing an improvement or extending an improvement adjacent to or past a particular property is not the controlling factor in determining the amount to be assessed. Generally, the entire project will be considered as a whole for purposes of calculating and computing assessments, and that's where they take into things like surrounding benefit and those everything. So they tend to look at these and determine what's going to be assessed more on a case-by-case basis. So with that, that is what some of our surrounding cities do. You also have been given another copy of what we had found from some of the other cities as far as ones that are sort of similar in size to us and maybe closer to the northern part of the state, meaning Warren, Greenbush, Detroit Lakes, Ashby, Lake Elmo, North Mankato. The ones that are, like I said, somewhat similar to our size and potential circumstances. So with that, that's what the percentages are and what we found with the other ones. The big thing that we also have to consider is if we're moving towards this, we do have to identify a funding source that we will utilize to pay for the city portion of that. So that is what I found, and I'll take any questions.
In your discussion and research here, did you see from many of the cities what they're every year levying for that, or how most of them levy for it then, and then?
The amount, it can vary quite a bit, and it just
Say
really.
Detroit Lakes, reasonable, close to.
What they levy per, I don't know what Detroit Lakes is in particular. I do know that a couple of cities that I'm familiar with do about 70 to 80,000 per year. So that would be their portion of the bond payment. So for example, if they do a project and they bond for it and they spread the assessments out for typically 7 to 10 years is the most likely. They bond for let's say 70 to 80,000 as a bond payment each year. So that when they look for a project coming up for the next year for a street reconstruction or whatever, they look at how many blocks they can do and fit into that parameter. And what is a fairly common practice then is, let's say, I'm just going to throw numbers out. Let's say that the council determines that $70,000 per year is what the council is willing to levy per project in the long term. So if they spread the assessments out over 7 years, then depending if they're going to, what some cities do is then they levy $70,000 each year. So they'll have 7 bonds going at any given time. And so then, what is it, 7 times 7 is what? 490. 490,000 is what they would levy each year for that. But it would be broken out each bond. And so when one levy is paid off, that's when they're doing the following years. And that the issue with that is that's a substantial levy increase, particularly each year, that you're looking at. So it can be kind of a tough pill to swallow, but that's, I would say, probably the most common practice.
And with that in mind, have we looked at our historical and look at, the programs that we use, that Jason uses? Have we looked at what have we spent on streets over the last few years and then what their anticipated need is so that we could look at and say, okay, maybe 70,000 is too much or it's not enough? I mean, have we thought about that or looked at that?
Well, I guess what I can tell you is that we do spend the $250,000 that we get each year on that, on patching and in those type of things.
And at least some of that is on these streets that need replacement. So you arguably would have to spend a little less of that on some of these really broken up streets.
I mean,
In
really
the-
to look at it, you need to maybe know what our
Well, no-
possibility of what we're going to have out there.
Well, the one thing that, as far as the situation that we have here, in the fact that we don't, with the concrete streets that we have, we don't replace our streets nearly as often as a lot of other cities do, particularly the ones that do a project every single year are streets that are cities that are basically entirely bituminous, and they break up more and whatnot. So we really probably wouldn't necessarily do a project every year, so we could spread that out further. We wouldn't have to do that. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I was going to say, the last time we did, maintenance type of projects on our asphalt streets was 2015, 16, and 17. And I want to say each of those years, between seal coats, mill and overlays, I think we spent roughly about $1 million each year. So, to do maintenance on all of our bituminous streets in town, I mean, we probably spent $3 million. But again, we're only doing those every 10 to 15 years too, so.
If you looked at that, basically what we were spending on it, say, if we did look at part of that 250 and we were to change the levy to, for anticipation of those bonds, I don't think that number would probably need to be where it is. I'm just throwing out, that's kind of a common area.
Totally understand. Yeah, maybe that little extra money we have from last year, you can put into that fund right away.
Portion out, that's the idea, that's why we're having this conversation.
It'd still be at 5%.
And again, I mean, what we're looking at now is, I was trying to find that list of projects we had put together, which I can't seem to find right now, but, again, those streets, I mean, there was a combination. Some of those streets were bituminous, some were more concrete, but, I mean, those are the street segments in town that are really beyond maintenance at this point. I mean, we're looking at full reconstruction, probably looking at replacing utilities underneath those streets. So that's where the cost, or that's really why we're really looking at this assessment policy, because, as we talk about the special benefit test and stuff is, I mean, I think we kind of know that as we look at these reconstruction projects, they're a lot more expensive than even when you put it in the first time. So, if people were to contest those special assessments, I mean, would they stand up in court? And again, I think you can see, we have a lot of communities, within probably a 120-mile radius here that, again, the Warrens, the Greenbush, they are looking at an assessment reconstruction projects. They are assessing in that probably 30 to 40% range is kind of what some of those other communities are doing. And then you take city of Warroad, or maybe I shouldn't be saying communities here, but I mean, any reconstruction project, I mean, the city pays 100%. So, it really varies across the board, so.
David, you have that?
Yeah, as I say, the ones that were identified were 20th Street Northwest and 5th Avenue, 11th Avenue Northeast, that Highway 2 frontage road, Highway 2 frontage road to the 10th Street, 4th Street Northeast, by the American Crystal Properties over there, and 10th Street Northeast, 5th Avenue to 15th. Were the ones that have been determined to be in the worst shape.
So if we were to go with a percentage and levy for that every year, and let's say you throw out $490,000 that we would levy if we had those many those many projects going, what does that automatically do for our levy? Because we sit here every year and fight over trying to keep our levy under 5%. And we're talking $490,000 on levy.
Close to 10% just for that item.
Yeah.
Right.
And then it would just
So,
keep hanging there
and-
after that.
And what?
Then it would just hang there year after year at that same.
At 10%?
Yep.
And you're willing to sign your name on 10%?
Absolutely not. No, this is the conversation we're having
Right.
to the high
But I
end.
mean, that's what I'm saying, and I haven't had anybody run up to me and beg me to say, in town, to say, please change this. They're like, we've paid for ours. I don't see me wanting to pay for, but again, they've already paid their specials and they did their thing. So we haven't really had I haven't had anybody say, I really think that's a great idea to go about changing it so we can start paying. And there's kind of a fallacy out there that says we're going to start paying for new construction. And I think we need to get that out there as well. Again, is this has nothing to do with new construction. This is reconstruction.
And that is in our policy currently.
What's that?
That's in our policy
Right.
currently. New construction
But
pays for itself.
There's people out there that are having major anxiety because they think that that's happening. So I think that's what we really need to think about if we're going to go through this process. I mean, this could be like opening up a policy on raising chickens in your backyard. This place could be full. So I'm just saying,
You mean main headline tomorrow, chickens in the back.
chickens in the backyard.
Mayor, you have something else?
I have just a couple of questions. Maybe Mr. Emery, Mr. Gallstead, maybe you guys can tag team it back through the conversation. If we did a street replacement with our current policy, and if we were anticipating a 100% assessment to the adjacent properties, and if we were going to go through and have the public hearing, and so you'd do plans and specs, and then you'd have the public hearing, and then you'd ask for bids from contractors. You would decide what is the low bid, and before you awarded that bid, there'd be a waiting period that you could, for anyone to dispute that. And at the end of the waiting period, like we do for new construction, if that period passed without any challenge to it, now that period or that opportunity to argue against it has passed. So talk us through that. If we left it alone, there would be a path the city could take that would not expose it to any vulnerability or liability. Talk us through that as we're considering our alternatives, please.
Well, I think on any of our bids, I mean, we always have in there that the city has up to 60 days to award the bids. We have in the past on assessment projects, we've done it two different ways. We've awarded the project, we've completed the work, and then we've held the final assessment hearing, let's say after the fact, once we know final construction dollars. The other option is to, once we open bids, we can hold the final assessment hearing at that point so that the city council can hear if there's going to be any objections or anything to, what those assessment costs would be. So that's always an option too, is you hold the assessment hearing prior to even awarding the project. And they have, correct me if I'm wrong, Ron, but I mean, they have, once they've filed a complaint or an appeal with the council, they have so long after the council meeting to.
I'd have to remind myself on it, but essentially what you end up doing is two different ways. Is you give them you either let them come in and have the ability to object before you actually award the bid. You have the right time frame, or so before it's awarded, or you turn around and you have the ability to reject it after the fact, and let them come in. So there's a timing issue, and without looking at it right now specifically, there's two ways to do it. They're both timing issues that before you actually do the work, and the appeal period is ran, and you know exactly where you stand when it comes to any objections. And then if you have objections, then you can make your determination if you want to do the project at all, or if you're willing to take the chance on the objection. So it's all a timing issue. So you can do it without running into our, but if you do the project and then you do your final bids, or, your final assessment roll, you have no out, because it's already done. The money's the money's been spent. Now, if there's an objection to it, if we don't succeed, we'll say on that objection, then that money comes out, it comes from the city general fund.
If you wouldn't mind maybe figuring out what those timelines are.
I will, and I'll bring it to the next work session for you.
And then just one more thing. I think I've said it publicly, and I'll just say it again. In fairness, I like our current policy. Mr. Grassel, to your point of, I paid for my street, and maybe I just paid for it last year, and I'm going to pay for it for a long time. And maybe my annual specials are $6,000 or $7,000 or $8,000. And now you're telling me, again, I'm going to replace someone's street in an existing neighborhood. I don't prefer that. I think in fairness, I've always looked at the section of street in front of my house as mine to maintain. If it went in new, I paid for it. And if it had to be patched up and fixed, big mill and overlay project or seal coat, that's coming back on me. And also any replacement of it in the future, according to our current policy, which I think is very fair, it should come back on me as a special assessment. I do think that's the fair way. I see that with that policy, we're hamstrung to the state because of special benefits test. And so therefore, it looks like we can't replace a street in our city. It's a catch-22. Because if it's fair to do it all yourself, that's one thing. But if it isn't defensible in court, that's another thing. And so somewhere in here, so I'm 100% agreeing with you. I feel the street in front of my house is mine to maintain. But if in the environment that we are with regard to state statute, that no longer works, then we'll need to figure out another way to do it. Oh, and by the way, the top number for me is not 10% over our current budget, it's more like 2%. If we could, and so we wouldn't do one every year. If we did one now, we'd probably wait 7 years to do another one. So we wouldn't stack those payments. We'd have one payment that was paid, and then we'd be eligible to do another, in my estimation. I'm not happy stacking them up to 500,000. Not that you suggested that. It was just mathematical analysis. So I'm not happy to go $500,000 each year toward this. I don't think any one of us is. So that was just, to do the math of how it could be done, not saying we're even proposing that.
Megan, did you have something? Sorry.
No, it's okay. Just to bring up the point that if we do a special assessment, if we do the final hearing, wait for all the objections, the assessment roll is final. Therefore, if there's any change orders, any costs above what was adopted, that falls on the city. So there is a chance of additional costs coming towards the city for that project.
And that's the one benefit of doing the final hearing after the project's completed, because then you do know your final costs, where, like you said, when you do it initially, if there's changes to the project, those costs get borne to the city then.
Chad?
So is there, Ron, do we know, the mayor alluded to state statutes? So is there a way to have somebody look at? I mean, something might be a stupid question.
We should forward it again. The League of Minnesota
a
Cities.
state statute that was made in whatever, 1948 to put streets in or whatever it is not the same as what our construction costs and what property values are.
The league has a nice bulletin on
Actually,
special benefits.
what we're talking about is the special benefits test, and that's basically a constitutional issue that we have in Minnesota. And what that is that the value of the assessment can't exceed the increase in market value to your property.
essentially a taking issue, right? I mean.
It's a taking.
the-
Mr. Demers.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the mayor's bringing this up. It is an important thing. And, you know, to Chad's point, I don't hear people clamoring in the streets about this either. And that's for a reason, partially because we're 20 years out from an event that changed almost every one of the streets in town. I mean, it took out a lot of the oldest streets. They redid a bunch of the stuff after the flood. So our street infrastructure has been up to this point fairly new. You know, we've done replacements, but we haven't had to. I would say up until a few years back, we probably had the lowest percentage of people being assessed for streets that we've probably had since, you know, 50s or 60s. The problem is that as we age from the flood era, our streets are going to be getting older. And to Chad's point, like, we don't hear people clamoring for it, but we do hear people clamoring when we do assessments on new properties. We understand that there is a cost issue, and people are very cognizant of how much streets cost. So I think, well, it isn't a one-to-one, but even to what Steve said, I mean, we know that reconstruction can cost more than what initial construction costs, because you have removals, you're probably going to put additional infrastructure in, all those other things. So if we had the type of feedback we did when we did our last new development on all of these reconstructions as we go forward, we know the type of storm we're in for. So I guess to your point, yes, I don't see it right now, but in 5-10 years, I do see people being very angry. And we hear it every 7 years or 5 to 7 years when we do a third of our city with reconstruction. So it isn't an easy issue, and it's tough to be ahead of it, which I think it's better to be ahead of it, but it's tough politically because people kind of go, why are you doing this? My street's fine or whatever. But it is important. I don't know necessarily, I know which way I would go, because I look at the most successful reconstruction and maintenance programs we have in the city are actually run by Water and Light. When they do their power and their water, it's run well, it's completed in a timely manner, and it's done with initial assessment to new construction, and then they bill it out over time. They figure out how much they need, and it's part of your bill. I disagree with your assessment of what a street is. I don't think it's yours. It's ours. Every street in town is ours, and I don't think that 100-foot chunk or 70-foot chunk in front of yours is all that we're responsible for. I think we're responsible for all of it. So I like I said, I would be much more inclined to a system that's more similar to the Water and Light system, that once you get in, I mean, and people say, well, I bought into it. No, you paid the price to add to the city. That's new. You're adding to the city. That's kind of your entry fee. Once you've done that, then it becomes everybody's system. And like I said, I would go with something more in line with what Water and Light does with power and water. Understanding that unlike Thief River or Crookston, we have a mixed transportation system with concrete and bituminous, which causes all kinds of additional issues. I mean, to say to someone that their streets in front of their house are concrete and they would typically be assessed, $40,000 every 20 years or versus $5,000 every 7 or however it goes. And then they're going to pay part of that reconstruction on every 7-year thing. It's a tough thing. But then again, it gets to the point that it's not your street, it's our streets. And
Your opinion.
they're owned and maintained by the city of East Grand Forks. They're not owned and maintained by any people in town.
Historically, if you look at our policies, you pay for the deep maintenance and the initial construction and the maintenance of the section of street in front of your house. That's our policy. You can say it isn't true.
I'm not
but
saying
that's
that it
how we
isn't
fund it.
true. I'm saying that the policy is not aligned with what
It's
is reality.
long-standing for decades, and it's been effective.
When streets didn't cost as much as that they do now. And like I said, I understand the hurdles that would have to go through with it. And to the other point is, yes, it is a big chunk if you did it just on your property tax, but you're going to get hit either way, whether it's on special assessments or on your property tax. And I don't know what Clarence thinks, but I think I'd rather get hit on my property tax than on special assessments. Because you can take it as a deduction, right? I mean,
Not anymore.
well, I guess, yeah, not so much anymore, but I don't know. I guess I'd rather pay it in one deal over time than get hit whenever the city decides it's going to do it.
But the real inequity that comes in is just what we've talked about. If I'm on an old soil cement street and I get a replacement now, I have not paid in for 20 or 30 or 40 years to get that replacement. If I live on a brand new concrete street that I just paid $70,000 for the section in front of my house, and I start to pay ahead for my replacement, I will have paid twice, where the one on the soil cement street getting a replacement now did not pay twice. That's the disparity. If you start it at any given moment, and we can't have districts, we found that out, which would subdivide to the older streets. You could bring them in earlier, and then the streets, as you got ready to be replaced, you could bring them in later, but we cannot have districts. And so that disparity of the current condition of the street and the aging of the street and the residual value, life expectancy of the street, that difference is the inequity that would happen if in a single stroke we went to city replacing all streets.
Getting anywhere for you, are we?
Well, yeah, we are. This is progress. I have no love affair myself with one way or another, just so you know. I would love for us to just find a way forward where we can start to replace some streets. You can say we're getting ahead, and I love the thought of getting ahead, but we're not ahead. We have streets like 20th Street that should have been replaced 5 or 10 years ago. And we have communities around us that have gotten in line with the special benefits tests, and we haven't. So we haven't gotten ahead. We're a little bit behind the 8 ball here. That's okay. I mean, we can navigate through this, but we're not ahead. We're a little bit lagging on this.
Well, I guess it's kind of speculation at this point. What you could do is take the streets that are the most in need of reconstruction at this particular point, kind of give it'd be a ballpark estimate of what the cost would be, and then try to look at a scenario on what that would cost for a different assessment breakdown and what you would need to put away for each year to do that.
And we do have that. I know we did look at that on 11th Avenue Northeast, which was out in the industrial park. We did, as part of our report of feasibility, we did look at different percentages and what the assessment would be, what the city share would be. So, I mean,
Maybe you bring that
basically
back
got that
again.
done. We could easily bring that back.
I think you did it for 20th also, those same scenarios.
I might have. I remember 11th for sure, but
Yeah,
yeah.
bring it all back. I mean, this is good stuff. Bring it out in the open, hash it out.
Yeah, I think I've got that here. This is one for 11th. Yeah. Okay, here's 20th. So 20th, at a 50-50, city cost would be roughly $825,000. 40% assessment, it'd be $1 million, and 30% assessment would be 1.15 roughly. So depending on how long you paid that out, that's what the city cost would be up front, but that's not the bonded cost. And depending how many years, let's say we went with the 30% and we bonded let's just say 1.2 million over 7 years, what would our payment on that be? But then, yeah, it'd be real money, and then, but, we have 3 others too that are in need of repair as well. So, I mean, it's still probably not, and again, we could, depending when you phase them out, because it might be a little while yet too before we need to do another reconstruction again, because the majority of our streets are concrete, which goes significantly longer than bituminous, but.
Mr. Vetter.
Thank you. Even if we pass a policy that says the city's going to pay 30%, 40%, 50%, that still doesn't get you by the special benefits test. Someone could still argue that I don't like my special assessments, they're not increasing my value, and I'm not going to pay for them, and the city would still get hung for that other 50%. So our best alternative is to do the assessment roll prior to awarding the project, and then if all the citizens in that district say, yep, okay, I'm satisfied with my special assessments, then go ahead with the project. If you get some that don't want it, then the project fails. And at some point in time, neighborhood communities are going to say, quit arguing this, we need a new street. And then the special assessments will go through. The other side is you go to the state and argue the special benefits test and get the state to eliminate that.
But what happens if you're beyond that area and you take that road every day, and so you don't get a vote whether or not your route to work or whatever goes into disrepair?
Another route.
Yep.
Well, you don't get a vote. I mean, if you want to help pay for it, step up to the plate.
I think everybody should pay for it all.
I knew where that was going when you started.
Yeah. Mr. Murphy.
Yeah, one thing, and I don't know if this is good or bad, but I have been involved in many assessment projects, both where they've done the assessment roll prior to awarding the bid and after. And I'm not going to really say one's better than the other. They both have their benefits and they both have their drawbacks. So yeah, there's the benefits to having doing the final assessment roll once we get the bids and prior to awarding the contract. I'm just going to say the drawbacks that I've seen in those type of scenarios are I've seen several situations where one, possibly two, very vocal residents will go out there and scream and sometimes rile up some of the neighbors against it, which is fine, and threaten that they will take it as far as they can, and which then sometimes the council then will not award the project based on those. They say there might be 2 or 3 assessment appeals on it. And then if that's the case, one of the drawbacks that happens, it takes a little while to get there, but if this has happened, say, to the point where 2 or 3 times, what you do see is that your bids start coming in higher, with the contractors kind of hedging their bets, saying, well, we'll put it out there, and we have to schedule. We have to make sure that if we do get it, we can schedule it and we can bid it on it, and we can get it done. However, they do have a history of not awarding them, so.
Especially when you have 60 days or whatever
Yeah.
to make those decisions.
So I'm not arguing one or the other, but those are
based on schedule.
I just want to be clear with those. So those are, there's the benefits and there's the drawbacks to either way. So those are the ones that I've seen.
Historically, what have we seen where we ended up paying with special benefits in the last 5 years? What have we dished out as a city?
Well, the biggest one was the trailer
Right,
court.
and
The civic center there.
Dollar amount, rough, not asking for exact numbers. Was it 200,000, 400,000, 200?
It was over 100 for the trailer court.
140 or
Yeah, it was over 100 for the trailer court. Yeah. With the settlement.
I mean, so historically, I mean, we've had a handful here and there. Has cost the city maybe 150,000
Historically, it's been commercial.
commercial.
Yeah, historically, we haven't had any real pushback from residents. However, well, the last one we had, you started seeing it.
That's typically because residential is less likely to undergo the cost that it takes to fight a special assessment, to get the appraisal done, to get an attorney, those type of things, it can be kind of costly. which is typically why you see less of it in the residential. However, when assessments, start getting towards the 20,000 range, whatever, then it maybe starts making more financial sense to, or the benefit maybe outweighs the cost.
And their frontages are smaller too. If you got a big commercial establishment versus a 90-foot residential lot, and it carries to lineal feet of road, so the dollar amount would swing pretty hard in the high direction on a big development, which would be more toward commercial.
Which makes it more, the risk better, for the investment in fighting it.
Yes.
And part of the city already does get some maintenance to their, or reconstruction to their streets done through the maintenance program, because when we pop out panels and replace those on concrete streets,
We patch a lot of asphalt too.
everybody in the city pays for those.
And we patch a lot of asphalt too. That's good.
That money's coming from water and light, and your water and light bill is higher because of it.
Or parts that 250 we do as a
I'm
council.
saying like the $250,000.
It comes from water and light, with capital projects.
That's
That's
state,
how-
Only maintenance.
Yep.
So it's only for facilities, it's not for streets.
straight from state aid.
What's our next step?
Just gonna ask.
I think we're making real progress here.
18% levy is what the next step looks like.
I guess as going back to the question of why would you do any citywide portion, to your point, Mr. Vetter, the hope would be to do it in such a way that even if challenged by the special benefits test, that you would prevail. You could show the value that you've added and everybody'd be happy. And really, we've done right by our citizens pertaining to the state statute. That would be the reason you would do it, is so that if it came up, they would know ahead of time, the city's going to prevail on this. We're not going to waste anybody's time. Let's just go forward with it. So that's the balance we're trying to strike, is we really did add the value to their home with the pavement section that was put in there.
So, Mr. Murphy, where do you want to see this go to or proceed? I know that a couple people have some things that they need to look up.
Yeah, well, I guess the thing I would be is, we kind of have an estimate of what the 20th Street Northwest portion would be.
Would you redistribute that, please?
Sure.
Just back to a new.
So, I guess, before we would know what that is, I guess we could see get an estimate of what the bond would be on a 10-year. So if we bonded a maximum of, let's say, 1.2 million, if we were going to do a 30% assessed, city take over 70%.
Show the minimum too.
Yep.
Keep going back to 30%, don't you?
Well, because that's the highest, yeah. Because it's and then you could step it down. I'm just saying because that's the max, you can always step it back from that. The next thing I would need then is there a number? Let's say if the levy is 5% for keeping where we're at for the 2020 budget, is there a number on top of that 5% that the council would be comfortable with to go towards that?
Or taking out of the surplus from the past.
Or that, yeah. The only thing with that is, then that's not guaranteed that it's going to be there. But that's another thing too. So it'd be like, say, a combination. Well, I suppose you could look at a combination between. Well, we could look at those sources here too. But is there a number above that 5% that the council would be willing to look at?
I think you have to get the bond dollar, what that's going to cost, because if it's, adding on 4%, 5%, I think you already know that, it's going to be a.
Well, I'm saying let's say if it's 2%, I'm just throwing that number out there, say if it's 2%, that we know that you would be comfortable with, and if we can look at some of the surplus or some of the other things that we might be able to find in it, then we would know that we could do this portion.
That's how you drill it down.
We would do as much as we could with the money that we had, if you know what I mean.
But you wouldn't be adding to it every year successively for 7 to 10 years. You'd have to pay that off. I feel, according to our little plan we're making, you'd have to pay that off before you start adding more street replacement.
So that would be within 1 year then, or?
No, over a 10-year period, 7 or 10.
Well, you know what's going to happen is so you replace 20th, and then somebody on 4th is gonna say, well, how come you picked 20th over 4th? Or how come you picked 4th over 6th? And now you got 8 streets lined up. And you're going, but we gotta pay for 20th, which is gonna take us 8 years, or 7 years, or 5 years.
That is why you have to prioritize the worst ones first, right? We have some that have been deferred for 5 to 10 years.
But my version of worse could be a little bit different than his, because he's driving on the way to his work every day.
That's one of the reasons to keep the local share reasonably at where it is now. It's a disincentive to say, I want my street replaced even though it isn't too bad. Maybe the local share stays at 60% and city pays 40. Well, that's some big skin in the game right there. I'm not going to be asking for a new street when I'm coughing up 60% of the money. That's a pretty good street even now.
Right, but we have, 4 or 5 projects designated right now for the? 4. 4.
But there are 2 that are of very, very high priority, and then the others.
So you get to pick, we have to pick the one of the 2 and tell them the other ones, you gotta wait for 5 to 4 years till we pay it off.
Unless we find some other funding. I mean, it comes in every so often. But at least we have a policy to guide us at that point. That's defensible.
I'd like to see the numbers if you worked it out with the 10-year bond, and I mean, that way you can actually have a discussion instead of saying, well, what if it's at this number? And,
Yep.
All righty. If nothing else, we'll move on, huh?
Thank you.
Number 4, review department changes for 2020 budget. Mr. Murphy, Ms. Anderson,
I've spoken enough. I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Anderson.
subsection A, Campbell Library.
Charlotte is not available to be here, but she did send you information in her packet. And she actually kind of did a little story and update on what's going on, what they've done at the building, what they've done with technology, what they've done with programming, what they've done with services and staffing. And the bottom line is the 2020 proposed library operating budget remains the same as 2019. Salary and wages have increased per the city wage matrix. So there are no other increases besides salaries in the library. So do you have any questions on the library? Like that. Okay. We have the fire department, and if Gary doesn't mind, I will just keep talking. He also did a little narrative for us. He talked about how he's got a new engine. He finally got a Suburban. He's still doing cartwheels. So they're looking at, keeping the budget low. They've gotten equipment needs. They've also got a donation from Enbridge, so they have another vehicle they're driving. So the only increase they're looking at is in fire protection of $5,000 in overtime. The reason for the increase is they're having a hard time getting paid on-call firefighters to fill shifts when we are short on people. And normally we fill nights and weekends with paid on-call firefighters, but I find it hard to get them to fill. And this is a problem fire departments are facing nationwide. Any questions on the fire department? 2 down. Okay, Public Works. Jason has 2 items. Do you want to speak, Jason? Okay, so Jason has picked up equipment this year. They are almost finished with the truck, a hook truck, which is estimated at $206,000. And so the increase is in the central equipment fund rental and equipment for approximately $29,000, and will increase the annual payment. And that payment will be over a 9-year period. And what will happen is that the central equipment fund, which is the capital improvement financing fund, pays for the truck, and then the department pays it back over 9 years. Street cleaning, they are getting they have already ordered a new street sweeper for approximately $245,000, and so we will be paying back the capital improvement financing fund for the essential equipment fund rental out of the street cleaning will increase by almost $38,000. So those are the only increases in public works. Community development.
Dale, Mr. Helms, you have a
Oh,
question?
sorry, question,
Yeah,
sorry.
Jason, did you have that other piece of equipment? Did you put that into the budget this year somewhere? Or does that come out of a different area for that piece you were talking about for doing alleys and stuff? That small piece for out in front of the Bobcat? Or does that come out of a different budget or?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, that's totally different. Okay. That's all I have.
Any other questions or for public works? Community development.
Can I interrupt you real quick?
Oh, sorry.
I just want to say that I did ask Nancy to go through the transit budget line by line, if you don't mind.
Hoping to. All 6 of my lines, line by line.
I'm sorry, I had to.
I think anybody's laughing because it's,
So, community development, Nancy, you want to take that, or?
I can.
Okay, thank you.
Because it'll just lead right into my last one.
go. You can just lead into the last one right away if you want.
Yeah, I can do that too.
Thank you, Mr. President. The only thing I did with my budget for the different budgets was really kind of highlight some of those line items that you may have questions in regards to. Anything that changed, I noted that under the line item. Sunshine Terrace was the one, none of those numbers have changed. I budget that amount every year. I just wanted you to know what went into those budget line items if you had any questions. So I really didn't have any significant changes other than I look at what my charges are for like utilities and services and what we receive in revenue, and then I just kind of adjust those based on what our averages are for the year, what I expect for the following year. So that leads into number 5. We are almost near 20 years with the new Sunshine Terrace building, and our common area carpets need to be replaced. We had a number of large rips on the first floor, and we had an inspection from our financing, our MHFA, who did our financing for the building. We wanted those replaced before they came so that it wouldn't be a violation and we would know we need to replace them. So we did replace the first floor this year, and then looked at quotes for the remaining second and third floor in the hallways. One thing that happens in a place like Sunshine Terrace is when one floor gets new carpet, everybody wants new carpet on their floor. So with the estimate, we do have $25,000 set aside in capital improvements. We would go over budget with that, but it would only make sense to purchase all the carpet at one time and replace the floors and the hallways at once. So I'm just asking if we can amend our capital improvement budget to include the full price from Brian's Flooring, which was the lowest bid, and replace those.
Question. What kind of carpet are you putting back in there?
We're putting those tiles.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that, and it's a tiled carpet, so then that way if we do have rips, tears, or stains, we can replace individual tiles.
Anybody else have any questions for Nancy at this time? I see none. Thank you, Nancy.
Okay, so would we be able to move this on, number 5, to the formal council meeting on Tuesday to amend that budget line item?
Action. I think everybody's fine.
Okay, wonderful.
You want to go back to 4 at all, Karla? Anything to add? David?
I might have a question to that amendment. Is that an amendment to the 2019 budget?
Yes,
And it would be an additional expense?
yes.
And have we found savings elsewhere to cover that? Because
There's $1 million in the cash fund.
Okay.
I guess my point would be is that we just estimated wrong.
So we've
So we-
found savings, yep.
Yes. So we
As we're
just,
going through the city charter, we did find a provision in there, David, maybe you can remember, which says, as we amend a budget mid-year for an added expense, we have to just show an offsetting savings to keep the budget neutral.
well, actually, Sunshine Terrace was actually a fund that we didn't even budget in the past, and we just started budgeting for it since I started. And so I guess, I don't know if that falls under the charter, if that's just a general fund item, and I think David and I could check on that, but the same thing with an enterprise fund, that they run a little differently, and actually Sunshine Terrace is really an enterprise fund, that, if there's money in the fund, then because of profits, or, higher revenue for the year,
Perfect.
that would be something that we could spend on.
Right, because if we amend to spend up, it's, that portion doesn't come from the general fund if we don't have it. It's,
Yep.
it's already been accounted
You can
for.
show the revenue available to not have it adversely hit the bottom line. That's the one thing I think the charter was saying is you cannot amend to show a negative balance at the end of the year on the general fund balance.
Well, and part of the reason that if you look at the income on the enterprise funds, like the Sunshine Terrace, that the only thing that's skewing that would be depreciation. And this is, in essence, covering depreciation because we're replacing carpet that's been depreciated.
Yep. Cool.
Anybody else have anything on that? I see none. You guys have nothing else?
Only that I gave an updated revenue and expenditure summary for the general fund, and it's at about a negative $210,000. So we are, looking at things. And next work session, we will have the other departments present.
If I could, Mr. President, on that number, I did have an email from a resident who said, in the middle of all of this, we're running a deficit? Well, how could we be running a deficit of $209,967? Just so everyone is clear, we're not budgeting a deficit. Whatever number that ends up, if it's a negative number, that's our commitment to take the savings from, let's say, the 2018 budget, the savings to offset tax for our community in 2020. Right? That's basically what we're saying. This isn't, oh, shoot, we have a deficit. How are we going to fix that? That is us saying we're allocating the abundance from 2018, the overage that we saved, toward this budget coming up in 2020 so as not to raise taxes any more than necessary. So I hope people are clear on that. We're being very intentional. If we're going to bring that number down to a number that we all agree to, and that's the number that we're willing to take from our 2018 surplus and buy down the expenses for 2020.
Really, you're at a 7% levy because it's negative 200,000. So you're going to buy it back down to 5%, so you're really not reducing the property tax for next year. You're just getting to that 5%.
And what we would actually do, if you, say, today decided that you would do that 209, we would actually put that up on the revenue section where it says reserved use or excess from available. We'd actually add a line in there of that, we are using our fund balance.
Yep.
And that it would become a zero at the bottom.
But we're still working that down, aren't we?
Correct.
I like it.
All right, nothing else? Entertain a motion to adjourn. Moved by Repo, second by Demers. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion is carried, means adjourned.